Well, hello. And today we're going to move on to looking at hooks. We're going to continue on with working with a bit of shoelace biting behaviour. I've also trained all of that out. We're going to move on with our bag work and follow the same principle that we've been looking at when we started doing bag work, that we're only going to do it reasonably light, well, very light contact, nothing like full contact, but just building and again maintaining these principles that I've talked about. That what we want at first is to maintain the structure of our postures that we've been training on the air, that we've been training with all our other Yiquan training, and that we want to bring those step by step into training on the bag, but without losing all the essential elements. So we want to make sure that what we're practicing, all the principles of Yiquan, all the quintessence principles of Wushu refined into our Yiquan practice. That seems very grand. That's our ambition, at least. I can't say that I represent such a grand thing. We're trying to do that. And what we don't want to do is immediately start hitting an object really, really hard in a way that then causes us to lose the structural principles that we've been developing all along. So what we're doing instead is we are using the bag as a form of feedback at first. So we're going step by step so that we can see the graduated training. Everything's logical, practicing the standing, practicing the movement, and then getting some initial feedback on the movement. And that's just like a recap of what we started looking at when we started looking at the jab and then the cross. So we want to move on to looking at the hook today, the hook punch, or what we can call a hook punch. Look, I'm aware there's multiple different ways of doing hook punches, and even within each one there's multiple different ways, and it's the whole point of an intuitive system that you can make it work, like you can react from any particular position that you might find yourself in, and that you're able to adapt and bend the rules. Like, there seems like a contradiction, because you want an intuitive system like that has no fixed techniques, but you also want to train people in techniques. And how do you resolve that problem? Well, it's quite simple, really. It's the same thing that every other sport in the world does. It's not like some secret mystery of the infinite Tao. You have template postures, right? And the template postures are like the fundamental basic posture, where, well, we'll talk about why it's in a particular way in each one in a moment. Fundamental basic template posture, which is like kind of the perfect example of something, and then you learn that, and from there you learn variations, and then at a certain point of quantity, you reach a certain point of where there's a change of quality, where you move from being caught in fixed movements, you move from the template postures to being able to do multiple different variations of those postures. It's as simple as that. It's not that difficult at all to other things. And we're aware that there's different template postures for different, well, there is for everything, but for different martial arts. And we don't want to discount any of those principles that other people talk about. We just want to engage them scientifically. So our template posture for each one starts in exactly the same way that we looked at before. So we'll do it this way, where we want our arms to be bent. So we start with our arms straight like this, and we step in till the arms are a little bit bent like that. That's going to be our template posture. When we hit, or I should say, this is our template start posture, and we can see again it's quite near the target. When you've been training, a long time, like I have, 30 odd years in Chinese Wushu now, of course one of the things you want to change is that you have this intuitive understanding of distance, or what we call range. So you will just adjust a little bit. So I want to be hitting there with a jab, so I just change my posture so that my jab would be like that. Excuse me, can you please go over that way? Go on. I know you think you're the star. I know you are the star. But you ought to stay over there. So I've got a barrier up that it's more psychological than anything. Aren't they all, really? He can jump over it, and he knows that, but take the whole camera out and everything. So our template posture is quite close. So after a bit, you don't need to do it like this. This is just a rough guide. You kind of have the right range in mind when you do it, just through habitual practice. So this is our template guard posture, and just like everything else, it is a template, i.e. a kind of ideal type. We know there's multiple different kinds of guards and ways of using guards, multiple different ways of doing it, everything. We don't want to discount anything, but we do have to get started with learning, so we do have to have basics. Why is our template guard like this? Well, you can start by thinking like this. Depends on what the problematic is, like, i.e. what is the problem that you want to solve. So if your problematic is, for example, Western boxing, then you might have a template guard like this. Usually what you're trying to do is maximize the rules to your advantage. So you might have a template guard like this, and you might have a wider stance. You're not worried about people kicking you in the legs. If it changes to more kickboxing kind of thing, you might just change the stance a little bit, you might just change the guard a bit, or you might not. Or in MMA, very often you see like a bigger template guard, but it changes in all those things. It changes and moves from being bigger, and it's all to do with range and what you're expecting and what the opponent's doing and what you want to do. So, and also personal styles and preferences. Things that are like the professional standard that make sense, and those are the templates that you can vary from. So whatever you can, I mean, the templates for other martial arts are generally speaking fairly obvious. With each one, you've got to think a little bit differently, because it's very tempting to say like the template for each one is like something like street fighting or something like that. And like, first of all, that's not true. The template for each one is doctrine of the mean. So this template guard posture, the idea is that it's a kind of middle ground between everything. It's a balanced posture. It's like no extremes. It's trying to find that balance, like everything is in each one. It's like, where's the balance? So a lot of our template postures are like that. Where's the balance? And it's the same with, you know, we can use short power to jab very close range, and we can use big extensions on our postures to jab long range. But we have a kind of doctrine of the mean jab, a template jab. So our templates, generally speaking, are based on the idea of the doctrine of the mean. They're kind of a balance of everything, particularly for these basic postures. And then more extreme postures get a little bit more task specific, just like the zhuangs themselves do. They're the foundation of each one. So nevertheless, even though it's the doctrine of the mean, usually our initial problematic within each one is we think about, well, what if we're having like a no rules fight, and we break it down like to the brass tacks. And it's, I mean, you could begin anywhere. You could begin like, well, let's think about an MMA fight, or you could think about, well, let's think about a kickboxing fight, and let's start. That'll be our baseline problematic. But we don't in each one. We think about, well, what if it was a no rules fight? What's our baseline problematic, and what are all our template postures for that? And that then influences, just like if you've got big boxing gloves on, that's going to influence how you use a guard. If you haven't got boxing gloves on, that's going to change how you think about a guard. Hence we've got things like the active guard in each one and so on, for however effective that is. But the idea isn't to glamorize that idea of street violence. It's a scientific starting point, like a kind of baseline. Everything else extends out from that. We think about that first. We think about self-defense as our first problematic, and then we can adapt, just like we make task-specific adaptations with individual postures, so we make them with our overall problematic. We can begin with the idea of a no-rules fight, which is a lot more terrifying than people make out believe you me. We can adapt and change that to think about sports-based fights. So the next thing to say is we usually think about a hook as a short range posture. And we can see if this is our starting template posture, that if we're going to hook in, well, we're going to have to do something to make that short range. If it's going to be flat, by short range we usually just mean that it's at a 90-degree angle like that, and it's usually taught like that. Yao Chen Rong particularly does hooks very close range like that. If you're going to hit from here, you're going to have to use some kind of compensatory force, like a step, to get in and hit like that. Or you're going to have to lean in like that. Very often, depending on the stance, like for an Ichiwan stance, usually the weight is more on the back leg, but there's lots of postures where the weight is on the front leg like that, and the hook might open up, like the body opens up like that. You see that sometimes. we'll talk about in another video when we start looking at articulated force, how that creates more space in the posture itself. But again, you don't want to lose that for that way of teaching it. You don't want to lose the 90-degree angle. So what the 90-degree angle does is it makes the posture really, really strong. And I looked at this in the video where I looked at what we really mean by whole body integration. I should say, like, there's no problem with doing it like this. Like I say, Yao Cheng Rong always teaches it like this. Then you see the other, particularly older Yiquan masters, doing it longer range. So we'll think about that in a moment. So our problem is, as we shift it back, lots of things are changing. So the hip point is changing for a start. So it's changing from being in right at the side like that. And as we move back, it changes to being on like about maybe a 30-degree angle. So if that's the center line, 30-degree angle, and hitting in like that. One of the things that does straight away is it makes it much more conducive to the hitting in with the three knuckles there. They just land like that. But of course, a bag isn't a face. But nevertheless, a face is round usually as well, till you hit it with Yiquan force. And it hits in like that, and it nestles in pretty neat like that. If you try to do it right on the side like that, it'll change which knuckles you're hitting with. Feels odd to me that, because I'm so used to hitting with those three knuckles, that's all. But the other thing is, if you've got gloves on, that changes the dynamics dramatically of what you're going to do. So if you've got gloves on, it massively increases the striking area. So normally you don't necessarily want to hit with those. You don't want to wrap it in. You don't want to wrap like that. But if you've got gloves on, you can hit in. And it doesn't really make all that much difference, particularly if you've got, lose some, particularly if you've got hand wraps and then a big glove, maybe lose some structural alignment, but you can clip and you can get a bit of a longer range, and it doesn't really matter that much. If you've got no gloves on, then the hitting surface starts to make a much bigger difference, as does the position of the thumb. So usually each one we don't hit that way, we hit that way, particularly Yao's Yiquan. You see hit that way. Hit like that, keeps the thumb right out of the way. It doesn't make that much difference really if you go a little bit round, but it keeps the thumb out of the way. But so it does like that if you hit in with the thing. If you start hitting in wider with this thumb up posture like that, then you start hitting with these knuckles instead. You start wrapping it instead of punching it. But if I change straight away to thumb pointing to the side, then I can change. I can hit in with the two knuckles now. I'm changing because of the range, like that. So it keeps the thumb nicely out of the way, but there again, so does that, like that. And if you want to hit in this way with the thumb pointing up, you've got to get more roundedness on the arm. It's like you've got to inflate the shoulder a little bit and get more of an arc, like that, to get round with it. And also you've got to turn with it in a slightly different way. If I'm just going to hit 30 degrees off at an angle like that, or if I'm going to hit round, see, I've got to lean forward round with it a bit and get round and lean like that. If I don't, I've either got to twist, I've either got to push my wrist forward like that, which makes it just a little bit more vulnerable. Just a little bit. I mean, people make it work all the time. It's just a scientific breakdown of the possibilities. Particularly if I want to stay back like that, to get the fist in, I've got to twist it round like that, or I've got to lean in to compensate like that, like that. If I've got boxing gloves on, I don't need to do any of that. I can just do that. I can whip it and I can hit with the wrapping knuckles like that. It doesn't make any difference at all. It's one of the good reasons for starting with like this kind of problematic, like bare knuckle, no rules. What's the scientific breakdown? Instead, we're going to think of like, there's a line here, there's 30 degrees either side, and that's what we want to hit. We don't want to hit in to the side. So we take away that problem of like, well, how do I get to the side like that or like that? And it's not that much, you know. I think if anything, it's a little bit better to do it flat like that, but I still feel like it's quite a little bit of an odd posture. For example, if the thumb's like that, I can get round to the side, but I can feel that my thumb is hitting into the bag like that, so I don't really want to go. But if I was to do it like that, it keeps the thumb right out of the way, and I'm hitting more with the flat of my knuckles, or I've got to push my wrist in. So there's not that many good options if you're going to do it off the spot. Instead, we think about either using footwork to get to that point, think about the problematic of wearing boxing gloves where it's not that much of an issue, or we think about it like this: thumb flat, and there's a line, and it's 35 degrees either side. That's what we're hitting, not the side of the bag like that. And again, remember, think about where your own head is, like that. And we're not going to lean forward, all we're going to do is lift up, and make contact like that. So we're not actually doing this kind of hooking. And usually when like in boxing, Muay Thai, when people say like you do a long hook, we could call it a looping hook, particularly from here, like if your guard is closer like this, or even closer like this, and you loop out like that, it's quite a big movement. We'll look at a few videos down the line, we'll start looking at the essence of martial arts in terms of always trying to create more power by how do you make a movement bigger. And in each one we want to take away like big things like movement like that, and we want to put them in the rest of the body to make the movement shorter and more efficient. That's the theory. So we're not going to do, it's a long hook, and we're leaning back, so it makes it even longer, but there's no looping in it. We're not going to go like that. The only way that we would usually do that, I mean, it's not wrong, and it's not like against the rules. It's just like we've got like kind of template rules that we're learning first, and then once we've got the template rules, then you can do what on earth you like. But we can also, like particularly with short power, get articulation in the shoulder like that. And that, as we'll look at in future video, I've already recorded them and they're up, so I know that it's coming up. Articulation with short power to get more movement. So you can take the loop out from this bit and you can put it in the shoulder like that and make this movement smaller, and that's particularly useful for short movements. But for our basic posture, we just want the arms like that, and then it just goes in like a spike, like that. And we use the pivot root and we hit at our own head height. And what that does straight away, the thing that I was talking about in the video about whole body connectivity, that when your arm is like this in a 90 degrees and it's a strong, I mean, it's putting a lot of strain. I mean, that is putting strain on the muscle, but it feels like a much stronger, much more solid posture because the muscle isn't being stretched. It's like when you stretch muscles to the limit. So like if I'm going to clothesline in like that and really stretch that muscle to the limit this way across the chest, that feels more vulnerable. That big movement like that. But here when we do it like this, all the force is going that way. The muscle it's not stretched, so it feels like a comfortable movement to hit in. It's a very strong posture. And what happens when we do change like this, of course the arm becomes like a lever. So, you know, it's our law of physics that if the arm is longer, or the lever is longer, that it's going to put more pressure on the pivot point, on the point of leverage here. But something wonderful happens because it's each one, and we have this concept of the straight but not straight punch. And just like with the jab, we talked about when we throw a jab, it's in line with the shoulder, so a lot of the force goes back into the shoulder. It's a straight but not straight punch, so a tiny little bit of the force is going in that direction, and that's got to be controlled by the musculature. When we do a hook like that, massive amount of force is going in that direction. It's not in line with the shoulder at all, but it's such a strong posture because all the muscles are contracted in like that. They're all really, really safe in like that. You could even do it like much closer like that, and it would feel even stronger because everything's just compacted in. And the longer it goes out, the more it's like a lever, and you would think the more strain that it puts on the shoulder. And that would be true if, for example, you were hitting in to the side like that, but we're not. We're hitting in at a 35 degree angle. Here's the genius of what Wang Xiangjia is talking about. Straight but not straight. Straight but not straight punch. What does it do? It creates this doctrine of the mean balance in between, like, yeah, okay, of course, some force is still going back that way, but just like the jab, it's locked back, it's pushing back into the whole structure of the body in a way that that's not. That's all pushing that way, and that's all controlled by this muscle. So even though it feels really, really strong, this is why you think like, yeah, you've got to train that area, you've got to train that muscle. It puts, however you do it, it's going to put strain on that muscle. So Zhao Daoxin particularly talks about finding these weak points in the body where, like in Xing Yiquan, everything's designed pretty much to be in line with the body so that it can just push the force back into the body, and you can control the force like that, just like it talked about in the whole body video. But when you start getting these more circular punches in, it's not like that. This kind of close hook doesn't do that. It relies on the strength of this muscle here to control it, and it relies on the fact that it's contracted. It's not being pushed to its limit like a, and if you were going to do like, yeah, you can do it, but that's why you think like, well, I've got to build really, really big muscles to control this force. But the idea with a straight but not straight punch like this, it's not the same. It's not the same for every punch in each one, I have to say. But when you do it longer like this, the benefit is it more of the force is pushing back directly into the structure of the body. When we do it on this, not on the side, on the angle like that, like that. It's pushing more back into the body, which helps to structurally reinforce the posture. That's genius. And it's so counterintuitive. You'd think like, well, it's a longer punch, therefore it's more leverage, therefore it's more strain on the muscle, but it doesn't really work like that. Practicing like this is one of the ways that you strengthen it in any case. So we just lift and we twist in, and the screwing force in, and we hit with that part of these knuckles here, like that. Just like we did with the jab and the cross video, and I don't want to rehearse all of that stuff, so we'll assume that we understand all of that now. So one of the things that will change then from what I've been talking about is that when you do this, you really feel that solid go all the way through the body, back down into the root and back. And remember that we haven't really looked at it yet, but we do look at it, but this idea of, actually there's a massive amount of movement, we have looked at that, there's a massive amount of movement in the body when we're doing this, but it's really, really tightly controlled when we hit the lock point. So if you hit in a way that is very loose when you hit, it dissipates force like through the arm. So if the arm is loose, for example, it will dissipate force through the arm. If the posture is very tight, if we're at that 80% point where there's no excess movement, we keep it really tightly controlled, well, that force has got to go somewhere, and this is what we call inertial force. It's just a law of physics. It doesn't mean that the posture is incredibly powerful, it just means that, like for example, if the power isn't enough to make the bag move back, it's still got to go somewhere. So it can go back into you, or it can go up that way. I mean, it's different if you do that. Like if I push like that, or I hit like that, it's a similar amount of power, but it's a different kind of force, this kind of inertial force. And we really maximise that inertial force when we have this kind of, when we bring it up to the lock point and we have this bodily control where everything tenses for a split second at the lock point, because that the force that we generate in around Fa Li, it can't be dissipated in body movement. That's why we start training like this, or one of the very important reasons. When I said we're looking for all the little loose parts that need tightening up, one of the reasons that needs to happen is that any loose part dissipates force. The more tense we are, like past that 80% point, the more we're brittle, and it's brittle force, so it becomes like easy then for there's no resilience. We need some resilience when we hit. It's easy to damage ourselves or hurt ourselves if we're completely tense. We need this springiness even when we're tensing in at a lock point. But below that 80% point, if there's little bits of the body that are loose, and it could be anything, it could be like if the routine is loose but it pushes us back like that, which does happen, then we lose force. Force is dissipated through that. But if we're at the right 80% amount of tension, then that force has got to go somewhere. And just like when the force goes up into the bag, so the force is transmitted from us into the bag. And that maximizes our ability to transmit force. Like, we don't want to waste any of the power that we generate. Everything's about, as I said right from the start, it's all about how much power can you generate in a configuration whilst being mindful of the context of the reality of the fight. We don't want any loose, we don't want to be floppy. That dissipates all the power in us. We want all the power to go into the target. I hope that makes sense. It's been a very long day at work. But I know I've got so much I want to talk about and share about each one while I can. So nothing can change the fact that when I do it like with a jab, a lot of force comes back into the body, directly into the body. So the consistency of the structure itself, not just the way that the structure is knitted together, but the way that the structure is stacked. This is really, really solid. Nothing can change that. When I change that to a hook, the force is no longer coming straight back into my body. We can get it to a certain degree. That's why we have this straight but not straight concept for each one punches. Again, it's the doctrine of the mean. This is too, I've talked about it before anyway. This is too brittle, and if this is too close range, this is somewhere in between. It's as much in alignment with the shoulder as we can possibly get it, whilst it's still being a hook that, well, we can, it's misleading to say hook, so you could say like, you know, circling meteor strike, it's usually traditionally called in Xing Yiquan, something like that. When it's round like this, when it's just this straight but not straight, it's a doctrine of the mean between rooting it back into the overall bodily structure, but also it's still being hitting in on an angle like that. But nothing can change that the force is much more going back that way, and that has to be compensated for in different ways. And it's not enough to just think about power. So when people talk about omnidirectional force, two things. One, they always think about issuing force equally in every direction, so they don't think about the way the posture is stacked in order to, I think in the last video I was saying skew when I meant stacked. The way the posture is stacked, determines where the majority of the force you generate will be targeted, and that's just like a law of physics in terms of how the structure itself that you form, if you're leaning just different ways, or just if you stack it or skew it in different ways, then it makes somewhere else like, I think the example I used was, you can direct force to the punch, or you can direct force to the elbow, and I can feel in my own, the way that I'm just skewing it forwards and backwards, I can feel myself in the stack, that those are different. I'm leaning back a little bit more with if I want to elbow back. So they're just slightly different, and those things help to transform hunyuan li into a point, even though you're releasing force from different parts of the body. But the other thing that's important about hunyuan li that people don't talk about is that when you hit something, you get force transferred back into your body, and that force has got to be managed. Hence we need this kind of elastic, hence we don't want it 100% tense. Hence that's what Wang Zhengjai calls brittle force. So when we hit, force comes back into the body. We need that springiness, so we need it to be even when we tense to hit through the target, we need it to be springy to absorb that force, because some's going to come back in the body. But we also need to really control the structure itself, so there's minimal movement, so that any force, it's got nowhere to go. I mean real force, not like chi or something like that. I mean real kinetic force, which is the phrase Yao Zhong uses. That's got to go somewhere, and the more we can control it, we don't want to control it to the point where we go past the 80% point and we start tensing it, we become brittle. But the more we can control it to that 80% point, the more it's got to go somewhere. It's like electricity in that sense. The force is real, it's got to go. So if force is going into the bag, that's not magic. Force has got to go somewhere. And if it can't dissipate through loose bits of the body, then it will go into the bag. And that's also like a critically important aspect of hunyuan li and how it functions. And again, you never hear anyone talk about that, which is really, really interesting, because it's so obvious. And I think one of the big reasons for that is just people aren't hitting things, and they're not hitting things with power, so they don't know this. Answers on a postcard. I think that's a solution. You've seen too much like this. You've seen too much testing structure, not enough hitting with power. If you're just doing testing structure, you never get beyond that point where you're using real whole body force and feeling it real. It happens like we're training it at this stage. So it's happening at that kind of light level. But if you use real force, then you've no choice but to be made aware of the fact that the energy you're putting into the bag goes back into you, like the way that you hit, you generate force. This is one of the rules of inertial force. So if you're hitting with power, yeah, the energy can go up into the bag, like, it can make a bag go up and down like that. But the energy is just going to go wherever it can. So like, imagine the bag's 100 times stronger, all that energy is just going to come back into my body, and it won't matter whether I've got 80% correct consistency. If I just punch a wall, it won't matter if I've got 80% consistency. That energy is going to come back into rebound back into my body. Maybe the language is misleading when I speak like that, but you can see that, yeah, some energy goes into that. And if I punch the wall, the energy is there already in my arm. I realise that, but it's got to go somewhere. That force that I'm throwing forward into the wall has got to go somewhere, and it'll go to the weakest part, which is my arm. If I punch the wall, and it might be the bag, if the bag's loose like that, but it might also be back into my body, depending on how good or poor my use of structure is, how heavy the target is, and so on. So that 80%, that's just a guideline. If somebody with a really hard head, more force is going to come back into your body. That's just the way it is. Hit a really hard bag, then you've got to start thinking again about the consistency in the way that you use your body. And one of the interesting things about that is you've got to think about lowering the tension threshold when you hit a much heavier bag. So that's a much more sophisticated. And the reason for doing that is so you don't injure yourself. So if 100% tension makes you brittle hitting a bag, so it can if the bag is heavier, denser. So you've got to come to terms with it. The one that I'm hitting most of all in the gym, that's the heaviest bag I've ever worked with. I don't know if it's the heaviest, it's the densest. It's so unbelievably dense. And everyone's using hand wraps on it and that, and everyone's hurting their hands and all that. I never use hand wraps. It's really easy to hurt your hands on it. At first I had to really get used to it, but then I realised what I have to do is lower the tension that I'm putting into the power hit. So in the end I was getting the same amount of power, but I was changing that ratio, so I was only using about 65-70% tension at the end, because otherwise it would make my strike too brittle. But for this fairly normal bag, we want about 80%, and for a human head anyway, 80% is pretty much spot on. 80% is our consistency, our tension point between relaxation and tension. Only when we hit, we bring it up to that. So that's tons and tons of talking again, isn't it? So what we do next is all our basic exercises, and we're going to use this longer movement like this, and the arm just lifts and sticks in like a spike like that. So it's not going to be a close range hook like that. And let's not even think of it as a hook, let's just think of it as some hunyuan meteor fist. And just like with the jab, we do exactly the same thing. We don't think we can rush it just because we did it with the jab. What I'm saying is, now it's a different ask. So this idea of 80% relaxation, 80% tension, 20% relaxation, well, that starts becoming a more sophisticated concept now, because different parts of the body might have to adapt in different ways. So in this case, this muscle group around the shoulder, you've got to be really careful of getting the balance, the ratio just right. This is how you do it. You bring it up step by step. So we start with our usual hit and stop, and we just do 8. That's 7, there's no need to do it. And then get through it. So, just like a spike, so there's no looping around it, there's no hitting and pulling back like that. It's just here, it's here, and then it's there. And it's this concept of teleportation movement that we've looked at. I'll do a few the other way so you can see it from there. So I'm quite near the door here, in my luxury training studio that I can afford with all the money I make from teaching Wushu. But nevertheless, the posture's got plenty of room to hit. Yeah, I'm not going to get through to the side of the head, obviously, but that's not what this posture's for. It's just coming in on a little bit of an angle. I've got plenty of room to get that in, so that's another benefit of this kind of way of doing this punch. So, like that. See, there's nothing there. We've taken the movement that would have been in the arm and we put it into the body. I'm going to look at that in much more detail over a series of videos that I've already filmed, are already waiting to come out. What we call articulated power. We put the movement into the body. It's the essence of what we're doing in each one. This is what these charlatans don't get. When we say a small movement, actually the movement's huge, as Yao Zhongzhen says. The movement in the whole body is enormous. So, 1, like that. Hit and stop, like that. Then exactly the same as we did before. Or we can do a couple of things. We can choose which way we do it. Either we bring it up to a bit of a sharper, slightly more sharper movement. So we'll do that first, seeing as I've said it. We get our posture. If you need to, just check. Just do it like that, like that. Just a little bit. We don't want too much. We're training so many things with the slower movement, the less powerful movement. Don't look down on it. So, just a little bit more. Do 4 either way. So, too powerful, that's too much. Like, we're nowhere near full power, but nowhere near full power or speed, but we just want enough so that we build up, and like that idea of the 95% point, you kind of know yourself when's it time to just, that's all we're going to do. Step by step, we're going to start upping the power by degrees, 10 degrees each time, just up the power. Next, just like with the jab, we'll do the hit, and then the relax back into the guard posture. So, do it much more, that's much too heavy. I'll do it nice and light first. And of course, there's all the arguments around the guard. Of course, it's a big open guard. Of course, you can get smacked in the head. We know that. It's an initial training exercise. What it's teaching us later on, we'll bring into using with movement and covering up like that. step by step, breaking it down into its elements. Why are you talking, love? We've just been out. So you can hear everyone outside playing, that's what it is. So, and the other way, just a little bit more. And the sharpness can be in the speed, or you can just put it in a little bit more like that. See, the sharpness wasn't there in the Farley, or we can do Farley faster but with a lighter movement. You can break it down into all these different elements. For now, just a little bit sharper, and then back into the guard posture. Forgot what we were doing. Like that. Next, before we take it any further, we go back to the idea that I talked about, that you start having longer periods of wait before the posture. That contradicts everything that we think about. Well, I just want to bang it as hard as I possibly can. Let me rephrase that. We do this zhuang posture that we practice this, we haven't got to this yet, we practice this like a zhuang with a space in the hands like that, like I talked about before, and we just hold for like 3 or 4 seconds. Then no movement whatsoever, no pre-movement, and just go. It's too fast and too powerful. I want it lighter than that first. I like that. Try and notice in yourself any little move the backhand first. That's how you don't put any tells in your hand. Notice how many people have a little thing like that. I do it myself sometimes. You see loads of pro fighters do it. Just a little before they punch. You start noticing things like that. Drill it out, stand. So there's going to be nothing. There's going to be no pull back into it. There's going to be no round like that. Just going to dink straight in, teleportation. You can do it up to I'll do it up to the hit and stop first. Or you can do it hit and pull back like that. Remember, we use this like somatic bounce movement. Use the energy of the bag to pull back off it. Or the other way. Now we can change to doing that, but now, just like with the jab and the cross, we bring in sharper movement around there. So we're holding our posture like a zhuang. And we just bring it in. A little bit more power, a little bit sharper. Same the other way. Maybe you want to hold for a while. And just keep imagining in your mind, when am I going to go, And you'll feel it. I can still feel it even myself now, like that, the command to trigger the movement, that, like you feel it, like it's very hard to explain, but you can feel it in it's like the nerves are kind of ready to go, and they're like, because you're thinking about doing it. I mean, it's not there. It will be, you don't want agitated nerves when you're actually sparring or fighting. It's not there when I'm just normally training or sparring, but when I break it down into standing like this, I can really feel the impulse to, it's like a kind of fluttering, agitated impulse to do it. That's why I was saying in the other video, it's kind of like Tourette's. Feels like that to me. As a Tourette's sufferer. I don't buy into all this. Oh, Tourette's is a wonderful, diverse way of being. Actually, it was just nothing but misery for me. I mean, it might be for someone else, but not for me. So I really see that as suffering. So relax. And again, being aware of, if you're going to hit a bag, even just dead light like this, it brings tension. Just the expectation of it brings tension into the body. It's fascinating how much we learn from doing this. a little bit out of range. Just got it though. That also starts having an effect on, with the bag moving like that, it triggers things in there, like, because when it comes closer, like, it triggers the urge to throw the movement, you know. So all of these things are training the intent. They're taking our standing and they're taking it, all those things that we were playing with in standing and the idea of mental induction. Now we start feeling them in a totally different way. I mean, we do loads of different things in standing. There's loads of things going on with contradictory forces and play and things like that. But what we call pulse induction, where you just trigger the movement in a tiny little micro movement. And the bag's moving like this for pulse induction, but like you've not even thrown the punch, but the pulse induction, like the intent wanted to do the punch, if you see what I'm saying. Not sure I'm being super clear this evening, but it's there. But like if it swings towards me, it's like, but then I overrule it, and I don't want to go. You know, I don't want to go at that point. So, and you can really feel any excess movement in your body as you stand. You'll feel it when you do it. You'll feel it. You'll feel all these little urges to go. And you'll feel how big the trigger is, and you're bringing that trigger out of the subconscious in a way. You're becoming aware of it, or how it works within the non-conscious mind. You can feel it. You can feel those triggers agitated. We did a double root there. Double pivot. That happens. Yeah, I mean, that's all of these things are like, I'm trying to leave them in like little learning points where things happen like that. Like my back foot came up as well as my front foot, which is obviously not, generally speaking, what you want. And all that was, the posture wasn't quite stacked correctly, so it just pushed me back a little bit with and then my root compensated to balance me by just lifting up a little bit like that. You could do it deliberately if you spot it in time. But all these little things happen, all these little micro things that are really great learning points. Obviously, it also helps to get past this absurd belief that, you know, people have reached some kind of master level where they do everything perfectly. And then finally for this, still nowhere near full power or speed, nowhere near, but bringing in the sharpness of the Farley to add into the whole body consistency of the movement. And we can still even do this, if we want, we can do it just hit and stop at the target, and we bring it in again from our it's nowhere near full speed or power. And we don't even want to put much power in it. We want to feel like the Farley is the thing that we're focusing on, but we're maintaining the whole body connectivity. So just like nice like little dink into just a little dink. But one of the things we're doing here is we're changing the idea of what we're doing. So we're doing our standing like a standing posture, but instead of thinking about triggering the punch, we're thinking about triggering the Farley around the axis first, which is different. It feels different. And then the arm is just going to go out like a spike. If we can get those two things right at this really, really basic level, then we've gone up a level in our ability to use whole body force. So think about, before I was just thinking about moving from this arm first. Remember, I've talked before about where do you put your attention in the movement, and like, you know, this idea like where you crunch an egg for an elbow and it puts the attention in the hand. If you think like, if you're thinking putting your attention in, this is going to move first like that, that's different to thinking like, what I'm going to think now is all my attention is like in this rotational axis, so I'm thinking about how I use my shoulders to get power. This movement, this shimmy in there. So my attention is changed to this point now. And this I'm going to trust to just do its thing. And the other way. Nowhere near full speed and power. It's not what I'm training here. Training the mental induction, pulse induction to the. It's more than pulse induction. It's the mental induction to the movement, to trigger with no tells or anything like that. Just watch out for little tells like moving your fingers and things like that, or dropping the hands first. Just absolutely dead still. And also what it isn't, which differentiates each one before I've talked about before, it's not just like a robotic movement like that. It's not just that. I saw someone saying like, I mean, obviously you don't have to lift your foot into a pivot root, and we don't when we step and things like that, or from different angles. But he was just saying like, well, that's just there to remind you to turn your whole body around there. No, he doesn't even say that. He says it's there to turn the front of your body forward like that. He said it's just like a robot like that. Well, we don't want that at all. We want a phased movement where all of the body is going around. That's an entirely different. Okay, you can see the phase and the difference in timing with the pivot root coming up later. It's following the punch round because it's a phased movement. That's a totally different kind of movement. It doesn't make any difference at all that the arm isn't 90 degrees like that. Come on, Doc. Doesn't make any difference. Doesn't have to be to get there. And even when I do it full contact, see it on the bag, doesn't actually make any difference. And then finally, for this, in any case, we just bring it up to sharper hit and pull back using the somatic timing, the somatic bounce back into our guard posture, and we just try and combine a little bit sharper movement, hit of the posture, and the correct overall configurational consistency. And just like before, we can do it in any set that we want. We can just do it off the 1, 2, 3, 4, or we can do weight 1, weight 2, or hit and stop. All the things that we've done, we can do all of those. What matters is the posture itself, and just triggering it from the induction of the whole movement of the body with the Farley at the centre of it. And remember that I talked about the idea that actually that's an imaginary thing which is quite abstract. It's virtual reality that you have a centre line. And now we start seeing like why we need to think about it like that, because you can't actually use some kind of pulse induction to trigger something that doesn't exist. You can only use pulse induction to trigger the things that do exist, like your shoulders and the muscles around your body and the root and things like that. You can't trigger it actually from the centre line. So you can't just trigger Farley from the centre line. It's got to be the whole body. But somehow it creates this virtual reality sense that thing is there, and that's what it is that you're triggering. It's quite an interesting thing. Feel the tension. When you do this, feel the tension. Just let it relax out, just like standing. It's exactly the same as standing. It's a progression on from standing. Feel it relax. And go. How how many people talk about standing? I know it's important in terms of like forces in the body and mental induction to create this sense of omnidirectional force. How many people just talk about it like that? Who ever talks about it like this, ever? You know, this idea of actually transitioning that into the next stage, not this, not slow movement, transitioning it into, slow movement is just part of the transition into this stage where you're like this and it's just like standing. It's just like standing, and you're feeling all those impulses. It's just like the agitated trigger. We call it that, by the way, the agitated trigger, because you can feel it. Like, well, we don't want to celebrate that. We don't want it to be like to come into our spine or something like that. We're honouring it. We're recognizing like an injury. It's like an injury in our intent. We're honouring it. Like it's agitated. It's someone to go. We haven't got the calmness to. It's like the trigger is there. The trigger lasts 10 seconds. As long as we're standing, it's like we want to trigger it. We need to calm that. We need to calm that. And the other thing that we're experiencing, by the way, is like it's not a negative. It's what it is I've talked about it before. We want the intent to spot the opportunity and then be triggered like that. We don't want it to feel like it's an agitated trigger all the time, that it wants to go all the time. There's nothing to trigger it. We've got to induct that. We've got to use pulse induction to trigger it. Whereas what we actually want in a fight is we don't think about it at all. It just sees the opening and it just goes for it. That's the intent, does that, all of that on its own. So it's no wonder it becomes agitated when we do it like this, but we honour it. We focus on it, just like I talked about with Tourette's. Focus on the twitch, you don't ignore it. And it's such a useful exercise. I'm making it sound like it's not a good exercise. It's an essential exercise if you want to move on to the next. This is the next stage anyway. So, like I'm being super duper mindful of the trigger to go. You see what I mean? There's nothing to trigger it. When do I go? That's why when I was talking before about when it swings towards you, the intent then locks onto that as a trigger. That's when I want to go. And really good habit in Bagwork, when you're at a more advanced level, you can start playing with this, and you'll see me do it. If you watch me do Bagwork, you'll see you can spot it that like sometimes when I've hit and it's swinging away from me, I go again like that, because I'm playing with this phenomenon and I'm challenging it and I'm getting around. I'm not allowing my intent to be triggered just by the bag swinging nearer to me. Like I'll hit it and it's moving further away and I'll go like that. You've got to learn to do things like that and do them deliberately and spot them in the moment. That's a much higher level of training the intent to go for the shot in the moment. All these mad little things about hunyuan training that are they're so clever, they're so advanced, and even within each one, you never hear anyone talking about this kind of stuff. Answers on a postcard, please. So just waiting. And you can do it longer and longer. And you can even stand like for a longer period. And just go. That was a useful learning point as well, because you can see I hit it a little bit flatter. So you could just see that it stopped, even with the contact, it stopped. And when we say hit at the center line, when you actually hit an object, it'll always go like a little bit past, because you're going to hit and push through to the center line. So it just went kind of perfectly to that point like that. A couple more. Again, same phenomenon. Changed it then. I changed it like less direction that way, more direction in, just micro variations, task specific variations in the hook. You tell me, when am I going to go? See if you can spot when I'm going to go. You spot that one. I think I had a lot of pre-movement on that one. That's it for lead hand hooks. I talk so much. I want to do lead hand hooks and backhand hooks, but I talk so much. I think that'll have to be it. I hope that makes sense. Sometimes I think they don't make sense and I look back at them and they do make sense, but I've talked too much. Hope that's useful. Hope that begins to just take it up to the next level of thinking about and understanding some things around whole body structure, and link it back into the video that I did about whole body structure and really challenging these ideas around so-called kinetic chains and things like that. And people who talk about omnidirectional force, but there's never any conception of like how you would stack a posture to direct force to one particular point, or the feedback that you get from hitting an object, and how that also has to feed into omnidirectional force in multiple different ways, and just the overall physics of an object feeding its energy back into you when you hit it, and the way that you use consistency to ensure that you transmit that energy into the posture, that begins to explain things like why you have this kind of fixed movement. We always say, like, you know, it's somewhere between Western boxing and traditional wushu, somewhere in the middle. It's kind of like the postures we might see from MMA, but it's the structural movement of traditional wushu. It's the doctrine of the mean between the two. And why do we do that? Why do we have these postures like that? And now we understand, like, we don't want to be brittle, but we need to transmit all the force. And if there's any looseness in the body, then that will dissipate force. And we want to absolutely maximize every ounce of personal power that we can possibly muster into the strike. That also is why we started doing it like this, because this helps us train, it helps us locate where are those little points of looseness where it starts to dissipate, and it starts to change a little bit when we change it into the hook with the angles and so on, that with everything that we've talked about. So I hope that was useful to some degree. One love. Listen, nourish everyone's development. I know there's a lot of contention out there and there's people arguing about all kinds of things, and I say some harsh things sometimes, I know that. Let's work towards the development and promotion of each one. We need to promote, we need to get the word out, so spread the word, leave a comment, of course criticise what I say. It's an open science. Of course, I'm not even close to knowing everything there is to know about it. Whoever will be. Knowledge should be social, it should be a debate. So as long as it makes sense, as long as it's reasonable, it can be up for discussion. If it's just meaningless criticism from people who are just anonymous, who say that they do it in an amazingly different way but won't show it, that's not science, it's just bullshit. Or who knows if it is or it isn't. So let's nourish the development of each one, and through that, one another and everyone. That was the dream. Wow, I've got a proper speech. See you in the next one.